Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the 30-minute chart of gold provided by netdandia.com. You can see that the price of gold is nearing a breakout here from this old recent high. If we go back to the daily, it barely shows up, but you can see on the potential eve of war, we don't know what's going to happen, but the news is not good out of the Ukraine. I'm going to spend the rest of the evening on this Ukrainian crisis issue. I want to take you over to the Ukrainian currency. And we're going to refer back to this a number of times when we look at this crisis. So let's go out to the daily chart. As you know, here's the daily chart of the Ukrainian currency. You can see a blowout type of situation here with the currency being devalued significantly since the breakout of tensions. But we're going to zoom in and look at some of the key dates for this and why that's so important. Sorry, I need to get my lines off of there. Okay, so let's zoom in and we're going to be looking at these key dates. Before we do this, I want to read the latest news here. Again, we're going to be looking at both sides. So this is going to be the American media perspective with the perspective also of the latest group in power in the Ukraine. Ukraine mobilizes after Putin's declaration of war, quote. Kiev, Ukraine mobilized for war on Sunday, and Washington threatened to isolate Russia economically. Wow. That's a big one. After President Vladimir Putin declared he had the right to invade his neighbor in Moscow's biggest confrontation with the West since the Cold War. Quote, "This is not a threat. This is actually a declaration of war to my country," Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk said in English. Yatsenyuk heads a pro-Western government that took power in the former Soviet Republic when its Moscow-backed president Viktor Yanukovych was ousted last week. Putin secured permission from his parliament on Saturday to use military force to protect Russian citizens in Ukraine, told U.S. President Barack Obama he had the right to defend Russian interests and nationals, spurning Western pleas not to intervene. Russian forces have already bloodlessly seized Crimea, an isolated Black Sea peninsula where Moscow has a naval base. On Sunday, they surrounded several small Ukrainian military outposts there and demanded the Ukrainian troops disarm. Some refused, leading to standoffs, although no shots were fired. So you can see this is definitely heating up. Now let's go to another Western-based perspective here. This is from FT, so that's going to be the British, but we know that the Americans and the British and the Europeans are all in this together. How Putin miscalculated in the struggle for Ukraine. Now this is from December 2nd. Now I'm going to show you some key events on the timeline. Remember, this chart is going to be our timeline. And there's going to be two key stories. One key story is going to be the Ukrainian president rejecting the EU trade deal. Now the date of that is November 24th. The other key date is going to be December 17th, and that is Putin pledges billions cheaper gas to Yanukovych. So these are the key dates here we want to keep an eye on. Let's get back to that story. To Moscow, the color revolutions were sinister, threatening its sphere of influence. No event has done more to spook the Kremlin over the last decade than the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. Vladimir Putin's worst moment looks like turning into a recurring nightmare as demonstrators once again fill Kiev's Independence Square, demanding that their country move closer to the EU and further away from Russia. The demonstrations in Ukraine are both a humiliation and a threat to Mr. Putin. While the Russian president may laud the deep cultural and historical ties between Ukraine and Russia, he is discovering that tens of thousands of Ukrainians would prefer to brave freezing temperatures and flying truncheons rather than be drawn closer into the Russian sphere of influence. What is more, if a popular uprising can once again threaten to topple a corrupt and intermittently despotic government in Ukraine, then the political lesson for Russia is clear. After all, it is less than 2 years ago that demonstrators filled the streets of Moscow to protest against the Putin restoration and to label his United Russia Party as the party of crooks and thieves. A pro-EU uprising in Ukraine also threatens President Putin's vision for Russia in the world. His main foreign policy goal is the construction of a sphere of influence for Russia, covering most of the old Soviet Union. Ukraine, with its 45 million people, large territory, economic resources, and long-standing links to Russia, is meant to be the jewel in the crown. It matters far more than Moldova or Belarus. If the Ukrainians turn west, not east, Mr. Putin's foreign policy is in tatters. I would definitely agree with that statement. So, I'll consider that the U.S.-British perspective on things. Now, before we go to another perspective on things, let's take a look at the history here of the Orange Revolution that occurred in 2004. This was an act of civil disobedience, supposedly by the Ukrainian people, as a reaction to an unfair election. I'll let you read the bulk of this, but what I want to get down to is the allegation that there were outside influences in this. Many analysts believe the Orange Revolution was built on a pattern first developed in the ousting of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia 4 years earlier and continuing with the Rose Revolution in Georgia. Each of these victories, though apparently spontaneous, was a result of extensive grassroots campaigning and coalition building among the opposition. Each included election victories followed up by public demonstrations after attempts by the incumbent to hold on to power through electoral fraud. Each of these social movements included extensive work by student activists. The most famous of these was the Otpor, the youth movement that helped bring Vojislav Kostunica. In Georgia, the movement was called Kamara. In Ukraine, the movement has worked under the succinct slogan, Pora, it's time. Chair of Georgian Parliamentary Committee on Defense and Security, G.V. Targamadze, former member of the Georgian Liberty Institute, as well as some members of Kamara, were consulted by Ukrainian opposition leaders on techniques of nonviolent struggle. Georgian rock bands, etc. Activists in each of these movements were funded and trained in tactics of political organization and nonviolence resistance by a coalition of Western pollsters and professional consultants who were partly funded by a range of Western government and non-government agencies, but received most of their funding from domestic sources. According to The Guardian, the foreign donors included the U.S. State Department, USAID, along with National Democratic Institute for Internal Affairs, International Republican Institute, the NGO Freedom House, and George Soros Open Society Institute. The National Endowment for Democracy, a foundation supported by the U.S. government, has supported non-governmental democracy building efforts in the Ukraine since 1988. Writings on nonviolent struggle by Gene Sharp contributed in forming the strategic basis of student campaigns. Apparently, they're not so nonviolent anymore. So, that's the history of the Orange Revolution. Now we're seeing color revolutions beginning to break out around the world. Of course, we saw the Arab Spring. A lot of people believe that that was also caused by the interference of outside forces. So let's look at an article, and then we're going to get to the timeline here. This is an article by Michael Thomas on StoryLeak.com. This is from December 12th. So that's going to be right between those two key dates we were talking about. November 24th, which marked the rejection of the pact with the EU, and December 17th, which marked the date when Putin pledged that $15 billion and lower prices for Russian gas. Who could argue that the moves and maneuvers taking place on the Ukraine geopolitical chessboard are as surreal as they get? The events occurring in Kiev are so transparent as to motive and purpose that one wonders if the CIA has all but abandoned their cloak and dagger MO of the past in favor of living color revolutions taking place in real time. CNN must be jumping for joy at the prospects of improving their ratings plummet. They get to advertise and propagandize yet another CIA-conceived, coordinated, and controlled from the top color revolution. Can the reader imagine high-level representatives from other countries showing up in the midst of most tense political standoff in Washington, D.C., offering every kind of support to those Americans protesting against the U.S. federal government? That's exactly what U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland is doing in the Ukraine at this very moment. Were any other nation to meddle in U.S. internal affairs, they would become an immediate target of terrifying Yankee gunboat diplomacy. The individuals involved would be promptly placed on the TSA's no-fly list for the rest of their incarceration. That is, of course, if they even made it out of the U.S. alive. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. What is particularly surprising about the current color revolution unfolding in the Ukraine is that this nation was the site of the very same CIA implementation plan back in 2004-2005. The Orange Revolution, as it was known at the time, was a classic CIA-engineered plot to impose their political outcome on the Ukrainian people, and they succeeded with flying colors. That CIA-sponsored coup d'etat was so successful that it has since been used as a model for every other CIA-manufactured scheme that has toppled governments and reversed fair election outcomes the world over. Now you have to remember that this president of the Ukraine who was ousted was the winner of a fair election, and in fact the election was overturned back during the Orange Revolution, and then they came back and elected him in 2010. So the people actually had the president that the U.S. wanted in there, and then they didn't like it and they got rid of him. In fact, the Ukraine is where the various social network utilities were used so effectively that the new MO has become the digital blitzkrieg. Never in human history have so many citizens been stampeded in the direction of overthrowing their government while being completely ignorant of the real forces manipulating the cattle prods. Many commentators have wondered how the current protests have been so successful in light of their leaders' previous experience with EU-US meddling in their domestic affairs. It was so obvious during the Orange Revolution 1.0 that the Western powers wanted to annul one election only to subsequently secure the victory of their chosen representative, Viktor Yushchenko. Can the Ukrainian people still be that unaware of the outright interference by foreign powers in their electoral process, or this invasive foreign initiative to overturn the recent presidential election to postpone the signing of the EU deal? Ironically, if a few thousand angry protesters ever tried to congregate around the U.S. Capitol building, they would be swiftly herded into fenced holding pens out of earshot of the closest congressman. They would then be arrested, fingerprinted, and ferried as far away from the scene of the crime as possible, never to fly again. U.S., EU, NATO juggernaut rolls into any town anytime it wants to. What is especially striking about the blatant intervention by the EU at all in Kiev is their carelessness. The various diplomats and leaders who are meddling seem not to care a whit about their extraordinarily aggressive and unrelenting intrusions. They just proceed to act with complete impunity. Then the host nation, the Ukraine, permits them every opportunity to meddle without consequence. Every proxy is given an apparently free hand to execute their agenda unimpeded on behalf of the IMF and company. As a matter of fact, the Ukraine government response has been so dysfunctional and inappropriate that one wonders if the current administration has been unwittingly co-opted by the same CIA subterfuge. It's as though the President, Prime Minister, and Parliament have been wired in such a way as to be perfectly reactive to the many strategically placed CIA cattle prods. Likewise, who has ever seen a body politic herded so easily as those who have shown up in the city square working for foreign interests which operate against their own national interest? The European Union has been nothing but a slowly sinking Titanic. This is precisely why the protests have been so fast in the making and fierce in their effect. With the southern flank of the EU, the pigs, in such disarray, and the main economic engines of Germany and France ready to blow a gasket, the EU leadership is downright desperate. The Ukraine represents their last hope to prevent the final submersion of the Eurozone ship. The Ukrainian people don't even know that they're being corralled onto a ship in order to save a Titanic that has already hit an iceberg. Why would any nation at this point join the European Union in view of its gross mismanagement, trampling of national sovereignty, and frightful financial condition? The EU is clearly a quasi-fascist communist political construct designed to thoroughly disempower the citizenry of each participating nation. In this way, it can be used as a very large and monolithic political, military, and economic bloc to carry out the wishes of those who ultimately oversee the Eurozone. The EU has become such an economic drain on the rest of the world, especially the U.S. Federal Reserve, that its current and future indebtedness and unfunded liabilities are simply untenable. Hence, the Ukraine is looked to as a temporary savior because of its many large and robust markets, well-established industrial base, and transportation links to Asia, as well as its vast natural resources and raw materials. Coup d'etat by way of consensus, especially within U.S., EU, NATO leadership. Now you know why Western leaders near and far have snapped into action at the failure of the Ukraine to sign the landmark deal at the EU summit. Also why every CIA black op is being implemented and surrogate mobilized to reverse the president's decision. In reality, the very existence of the EU depends on Ukrainian wealth because of its critical need to feed its predatory version of corrupt crony corporate capitalism. Note, the authors have no problem with genuine free market capitalism that respects the sovereignty of each and every nation. However, that is not the predominant form operating worldwide today. What reigns supreme across the global landscape is the terrorism known as naked predatory capitalism. It utilizes faux democracy and bogus rights and globalization as its main mantras. The ability of its promoters to take down a nation using other tools like economic terrorism, currency manipulation, financial sabotage, and corporate espionage is now the most feared force on the planet among those victimized by such criminal conduct. Truly a slick and sophisticated form of New Age colonialism has been advanced with awesome speed and success throughout this millennium. With the penetration of the internet into every national nook and cranny, revolutions and civil wars can now be Twittered and Facebooked from CIA offices at Langley. Even YouTube and Instagram have gotten into the picture. As more of the world's population becomes digitally connected, greater numbers of unsuspecting souls fall prey to every mainstream media fabrication that originates in the bowels of the CIA Directorate of Operations, now known as the National Clandestine Services. The end result just may be a color revolution coming to a theater near you, in a format, mind you, that is much more than the traditional living color. Michael Thomas. Now notice this was December 12th, 2013. So that's going to be between our key dates here. And again, let's look at our key dates. November 24th, this was the date when the president of the Ukraine rejected the EU pact. Now let's go back and look at our chart. This is the chart of the Ukrainian currency. Now you can see here's November 24th. On November 24th, you can see a significant strengthening occurring in the currency. In fact, the currency was fairly stable, hardly even moved up until that date. There was speculation, very interesting, that appears that the speculation was that they would sign it, and the people were betting that the currency was going to be devalued. As soon as that was going to be signed, there was going to be problems for the currency. Now we can see on that date, here's the drop, a significant drop. Then we had the beginning of these protests, really didn't amount to much, the initial protests. Then we had the beginning of the interference of the EU and the American diplomats coming in there. And then we can see on the 17th, this is when Putin pledges, December 17th, 2013, this is when Putin comes in and gives his pledge. And you can see from that date, there's a collapse in the value of the dollar versus the Ukrainian currency. The Ukrainian currency strengthened at that point for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days in a row until the currency was actually back, all the way back to where it was for the past year. In other words, everything had gone back to normal. Then we have the revolution. It began to occur, the protests began in January. They really started to go crazy in February, and then we had the ouster. And you can see we now have capital controls in the Ukraine down to $100 a day. There was nothing about that talked about when Putin was talking about signing his deal. In fact, the currency was strengthening and there was no talk of crisis. But now that we've had our revolution, now that the people have had their say, here's what the people get. They get a collapsing currency and they get capital controls. Now you tell me, do you believe that this columnist for the FT, and I could take you to New York Times, I could take you to the others, do you think that this columnist assessment is accurate, or do you think that this columnist assessment is accurate? Now I'm not saying that I'm on the side of the Russians, because Russia is obviously, and Putin, former KGB, these are no friendly guys. But at the same time, it seems to me that this analysis is accurate, that the EU was banking upon the pact with the Ukraine, and when the president failed to sign that, they initiated a coup d'etat, threw him out of power, and now we're standing at the edge of potentially World War III, as Russia has decided they're not going to take any more, and they're beginning to move their troops. And we'll talk to you next time.